In the middle of a brutal 19th-century war, the deadliest weapon was not a rifle, not a cannon, not even disease itself, but a pot of soup that soldiers lined up for every day, believing it would keep them alive while it quietly helped send them to their graves. And the terrifying part was that no one in command understood this yet, because the British Army in the Crimean War was losing more men to filth-spoiled food and catastrophic kitchen conditions than to Russian gunfire, and this was not rumor or legend but documented military reality recorded in official reports that showed hospitals overflowing with men who had never been wounded in battle yet were dying from dysentery, cholera, typhus and starvation all at once. And inside the chaos of this slow-moving disaster, one man who had never fired a shot, never trained as a doctor and never held military rank was about to step into the story, not as a hero, not as a scientist, but as something the army believed it did not need: a cook. Alexis Soyer was famous in London long before the war began, a celebrity chef known for running the kitchens of the Reform Club and for inventing modern culinary techniques that impressed aristocrats and politicians. But while the wealthy dined under chandeliers, British soldiers in Crimea tried to swallow half-cooked rations prepared in mud beside open latrines and rotting animal carcasses, and the result was predictable, though no one wanted to admit it. Men weakened from hunger collapsed faster from infection. Men who might have survived wounds died because their bodies had no strength left, and hospitals that should have been places of recovery became breeding grounds for disease. And still the official mindset blamed whether bad luck or fate rather than the system itself. And this is where the paradox begins, because the turning point in military medical research would not start in an operating theater or a laboratory, but in a kitchen built from scrap metal on a distant battlefield, where smoke mixed with the stench of sewage and fear, and where a chef from Paris would begin asking a question no general had thought to ask: what if the problem was not only medicine but food? What if the army was poisoning itself not by intention but by ignorance? And what if changing the way soldiers were fed could change the way they lived or died? These questions sound obvious now, but in 1854 they challenged the foundations of military thinking, because armies measured strength in weapons, numbers and tactics, not in calories, hygiene and cooking methods. And yet statistics were already whispering a different story. Reports reaching London showed that for every soldier killed in combat, several more died from preventable illness, and those numbers were so shocking that they forced the government to send investigators, nurses and eventually Florence Nightingale to Crimea. But even as reforms in nursing began, another gap remained wide open. The kitchens where food was stored, prepared and served were chaotic, unregulated and dangerously unsanitary. And this is where Alexis Soyer entered the war, not through a military order but through personal conviction, volunteering his own expertise after reading about the suffering of soldiers and believing that practical action could succeed where bureaucracy had failed. When he arrived, he did not see kitchens, he saw laboratories of neglect, pots crusted with old grease, meat left exposed to flies, water drawn from contaminated sources, and men too weak to stand in line for meals that offered little nourishment and almost no safety. And instead of accepting this as the normal hardship of war, Soyer began to document, observe and redesign. He studied how rations were distributed, how fires were built, how utensils were cleaned and how waste flowed through camp areas, and what he realized would quietly help reshape the future of both military logistics and medical research, because every spoiled meal, every dirty ladle and every poorly ventilated cook tent was part of a chain of cause and effect that ended in hospital wards filled with dying men. And the shocking truth was that breaking this chain did not require a new weapon or a new drug but a new system, and the man building that system wore an apron, not a uniform, and carried recipes, not orders. And before the world understood what he had started, the first battlefield kitchen experiment in modern history was already underway. The disaster had numbers, and the numbers were impossible to ignore, because by early 1855 British medical reports from the Crimea showed that disease was killing soldiers at a rate several times higher than battlefield wounds, and these figures were later analyzed by Florence Nightingale, who used statistical diagrams to prove that the majority of deaths came from preventable causes linked to sanitation, overcrowding and nutrition. Yet even as nursing reforms slowly took hold, another silent system kept failing every single day: the food supply chain, which began at docks, passed through warehouses, crossed seas, arrived in muddy depots and ended in cook tents where exhausted men with no training in hygiene tried to prepare meals for thousands using spoiled salt meat, infested biscuit and contaminated water. And when Alexis Soyer reached the main British hospital complex at Scutari Barak Hospital, he found kitchens without proper drainage, without ventilation and without organization, pots black with old residue, cutting surfaces never washed, and food left exposed to vermin and flies. And instead of treating this As background misery, he treated it as a solvable technical problem because in London at the Reform Club he had already redesigned professional kitchens for efficiency, airflow and cleanliness, and now he applied the same principles under wartime conditions. He introduced structured work areas, separated raw and cooked food, insisted on boiling water whenever possible, and created standardized recipes that could be prepared in bulk without destroying nutritional value. He also designed a portable field stove later known as the Soyer stove, which allowed soldiers to cook rations more safely and with less fuel, reducing the need to eat half-raw meat or hard biscuits soaked in polluted liquid. And while these changes sound simple, they directly attacked the chain reaction that turned hunger into disease, because underfed bodies could not resist infection and contaminated meals delivered bacteria straight into weakened systems. And as kitchen practices improved, parallel medical records began to show gradual shifts, not instant miracles but measurable trends: fewer cases of severe digestive illness, more men strong enough to recover from wounds, and a slow decline in deaths tied to malnutrition-related weakness. And this is where the story becomes more than culinary history, because the British Army and government observers started to realize that logistics and health were inseparable, that feeding systems were part of medical outcomes, and that prevention could be engineered through environment and routine rather than only through treatment after collapse. And this realization fed directly into the broader reform movement sparked by Nightingale's statistical evidence, where sanitation, ventilation, clean water and structured food preparation became pillars of military medical thinking. And what began as one chef's attempt to stop soldiers from eating poison disguised as rations was quietly reshaping how institutions understood the relationship between daily life and survival. And even as cannons fired in the distance, a different kind of experiment was unfolding in kitchens, wards and supply lines, an experiment proving that organized care could save more lives than heroic surgery, and that the path toward modern public health research might pass not through a battlefield charge but through a ladle, a stove and a set of rules written by a man who had come to war with recipes instead of weapons. What made this transformation remarkable was not speed or spectacle but documentation, because the changes introduced by Alexis Soyer did not vanish into anecdote. They became part of written military record, supply reports and medical correspondence that allowed reformers in Britain to connect cause and effect across thousands of miles. And at the center of this growing web of evidence stood Florence Nightingale, who was not only reorganizing nursing at Scutari Barak Hospital but also building one of the earliest large-scale data-driven arguments in medical history. She gathered hospital admission numbers, death rates, disease categories and environmental conditions, and when she later presented her findings to the British government, she showed that mortality had plummeted after sanitation and food systems improved, proving that structure saved lives. And this is where Soyer work crossed into the world of research, because his kitchen reforms created controlled variables, cleaner preparation, better fuel use, standardized rations and safer water handling. And once those variables stabilized, patterns became visible. Doctors could see differences between units with organized cooking and those without. Administrators could compare supply chains and outcomes, and statisticians could chart the link between nutrition and survival. And this shift from chaos to measurable order is a cornerstone of modern research methodology, because science requires consistency before it can find truth, and war had accidentally provided a brutal testing ground where small procedural changes revealed massive human consequences. Soyer also wrote detailed manuals describing how to build field kitchens, manage rations and cook for large groups under harsh conditions. And these publications circulated beyond Crimea, influencing military provisioning in later conflicts and even civilian institutional cooking in hospitals and relief operations. And the irony deepened, because while generals planned campaigns and politicians argued in parliament, a chef was shaping future policy through practical systems that turned food from an afterthought into a strategic factor. And as reports moved through official channels, the British government launched wider investigations into army health, logistics and camp design, leading to commissions that recommended sweeping reforms in barracks, drainage, ventilation and supply oversight. And many of these reforms echoed lessons first proven in improvised kitchens near the front lines, where the smell of boiling broth replaced the stench of rot, and where men who once expected sickness as routine began to experience something rare in that war: stability. And the ripple effects did not stop with Britain, because Nightingale published Analyses that influenced hospital design across Europe and North America, and her statistical approach became foundational in public health research, and embedded within those numbers were the indirect results of Soyer work, because improved feeding systems reduced background mortality, allowing other medical interventions to show their true effectiveness, and in this way Cook had helped clear the noise that hid critical signals in health data, and by reducing preventable suffering he allowed researchers to see patterns that had always been there but were buried under layers of neglect and fatalism, and the transformation of kitchens into instruments of survival became part of a larger intellectual shift away from blaming fate and toward engineering environments where human bodies had a fighting chance. And this was not theory born in quiet universities, but knowledge forced into existence by mud, disease, and relentless observation, proving that the road toward modern evidence-based health systems ran through the heat of battlefield stoves tended by hands more familiar with ladles than scalpels. As the war dragged on, the British government could no longer treat the catastrophe as temporary misfortune, because shipment logs, hospital returns, and mortality tables kept repeating the same message: soldiers were not only fighting an enemy, they were trapped inside a system that manufactured weakness. And this realization triggered inquiries that reached back to London, where politicians and military officials demanded explanations that went beyond heroism and blame and into structure, process, and design. And among the materials studied were the field reports and practical guidelines produced by Alexis Soyer, whose work in Crimea had demonstrated that organized cooking systems could be deployed even under extreme conditions, and that when they were deployed, measurable outcomes followed. Men kept strength longer, fewer collapsed from digestive disease, and recovery from wounds improved because bodies were not already broken by chronic undernourishment and contamination. And these findings fed directly into the investigations that led to the formation of the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army, which examined everything from barracks design to supply management and waste disposal. And within its recommendations lay a quiet revolution: the idea that daily living conditions were not background details but primary determinants of survival and readiness. And this principle became a foundation for later military medical doctrine, because it reframed prevention as infrastructure rather than luck. And while physicians refined surgical techniques and chemists studied disinfectants, administrators began redesigning kitchens, drainage systems, storage facilities, and ration standards, recognizing that a soldier well fed and protected from constant contamination was less likely to require treatment at all. And Soyer influence extended further through the continued production and adoption of his portable field stove, which allowed controlled cooking with less fuel and more reliable heat, reducing the dangerous improvisation that had previously defined camp meals. And this technology was not glamorous, yet it embodied a research mindset: identify a variable, design a tool, standardize a method, observe results, and iterate. And that mindset spread through military logistics, where officers began to collect data not only on ammunition and troop movements but on food distribution, spoilage rates, and health outcomes. And the chain of causation that once hid behind phrases like camp fever or seasonal sickness started to break apart into observable links, each of which could be addressed by policy, engineering, and oversight. And this shift marked a turning point in how large institutions understood responsibility, because it replaced fatalism with accountability and showed that leadership extended into the kitchen, storehouses, and water points that sustained an army between battles. And the intellectual climate that grew from these reforms also strengthened the work of reformers like Florence Nightingale, whose statistical demonstrations gained traction in a government newly aware that numbers could expose invisible failures and guide practical solutions. And together these parallel efforts transformed tragedy into evidence and evidence into policy, shaping not only future campaigns but the broader development of public health systems, where nutrition, sanitation, and environment became subjects of systematic study rather than afterthoughts. And at the center of this transformation stood a figure who never claimed to be a scientist, yet whose insistence on order, measurement, and method helped push institutions toward the habits of mind that define research itself, proving that disciplined observation in the most ordinary tasks could open doors that theory alone had left closed. By the time the guns in Crimea fell silent, the consequences of what had happened in those improvised kitchens were still unfolding, because the war had exposed a brutal truth that could not be ignored again. Large organizations could kill their own people through neglect as efficiently as any enemy, and preventing that required systems that could be studied, measured, and improved. And the British response did not stop with temporary fixes. It expanded into a long wave of institutional change, where food supply, sanitation, engineering, and hospital design became permanent subjects of oversight and analysis. And within this shift, the legacy of Alexis Soyer persisted not as a single dramatic moment but as a set of practices that continued to circulate through manuals, training programs, and logistical planning. His published guides on field cooking influenced later military provisioning in British campaigns and informed how relief organizations and hospitals approached large-scale meal preparation under pressure, and this crossover from battlefield improvisation to standardized doctrine illustrates how practical solutions can migrate into formal research agendas, because once consistent methods exist, outcomes can be compared, and when outcomes can be compared, patterns can be studied, and once patterns are understood, new hypotheses emerge, linking nutrition to disease resistance, linking sanitation to recovery rates, and linking environment to mortality curves. And these lines of inquiry grew through the later 19th century as medical science advanced and as governments built public health departments that investigated urban water systems, food safety, and housing conditions using statistical tools refined by reformers like Florence Nightingale, whose work had already proven that numbers could drive policy, and behind many of those numbers lay a simple operational fact: soldiers had once eaten in chaos, and then they had eaten in order, and survival shifted accordingly. And this contrast helped convince authorities that prevention was not abstract theory but something engineered through daily routines and enforceable standards. And the cultural impact also mattered, because the story challenged assumptions about expertise, showing that knowledge did not flow only from laboratories or academies but could arise from skilled practitioners confronting urgent problems with discipline and observation. And this broadened view of who could contribute to scientific progress encouraged collaboration between administrators, engineers, medical staff, and logistical specialists in ways that would shape modern research culture, where complex challenges demand interdisciplinary solutions. And as decades passed, the idea that feeding systems influenced health became embedded in military medicine, disaster response, and eventually civilian public health nutrition programs and hospital food services. And the intellectual lineage of these developments can be traced back through layers of reform to the moment when a chef on a distant front refused to accept that sickness and hunger were inevitable and instead treated them as technical failures that could be fixed and studied. And by turning kitchens into controlled environments, he helped create conditions where other variables could be isolated and analyzed, accelerating the transition from anecdote to evidence in understanding how living conditions shape human survival. And this is why historians of medicine and public health often point to the Crimean War as a crucible of modern reform, because within its suffering multiple streams of change converged: nursing, statistics, sanitation, engineering, and food system design. And at the intersection of those streams stood an apron stained with broth rather than blood, a symbol that the path toward research sometimes begins not with discovery in a laboratory but with the decision to measure, improve, and document the ordinary processes that keep people alive long enough for science to matter. History rarely announces its turning points, and the story of Alexis Soyer proves that some of the most influential shifts begin far from the places we expect, because when people look back at the Crimean War they see battles, commanders, and political failures, yet hidden beneath those headlines was a quieter transformation that helped redirect how institutions approached health, survival, and evidence. And the irony is sharp: a man trained to perfect sauces helped push governments toward modern research-driven reform, not through theory but through practice, not through authority but through demonstration. And the lesson that emerged from his work was both simple and radical: environment is not background, it is destiny. And when environments are designed with care, measured with discipline, and adjusted through observation, lives can be saved at a scale that rivals medical breakthroughs. And this idea became foundational in the later development of public health, where nutrition, sanitation, ventilation, and housing were studied as interconnected systems, and where prevention gained equal status with cure. And although Soyer did not live to see the full expansion of these fields, his contribution sits at the root of a tradition that values data gathered from real conditions and solutions tested in real time. And this tradition shaped how armies prepared for future conflicts, how hospitals structured their services, and how cities approached food safety and sanitation. And the chain of influence stretches from smoky tents in Crimea to the establishment of permanent health boards, research institutions, and statistical offices that treated daily living conditions as subjects worthy of rigorous study. And what makes this transformation memorable is the reversal of expectations. Power did not come from rank, and innovation did not require formal scientific titles. Instead, change flowed from a skilled practitioner who applied method consistency and documentation to a problem everyone else had accepted as inevitable, and in doing so he helped create a bridge between craft and science, showing that careful management of the ordinary could unlock insights that reshaped the extraordinary. And this is the final twist in the story of how one cook altered the course of research. The revolution did not start with a discovery announced in a lecture hall. It started with the refusal to let men eat filth, and the insistence on proving that small controllable improvements could produce measurable life-saving results. And once those results existed, they demanded explanation, and once explanations were sought, research followed. And so the path toward modern evidence-based health systems runs not only through famous laboratories and celebrated scientists, but also through the heat of field kitchens, where a chef with a notebook and a system quietly helped the world understand that saving lives begins long before the first patient reaches a hospital bed. The final measure of his impact is not found in statues or battle honors, but in procedures that became so normal people forgot they were ever new, because once institutions accepted that food systems, sanitation routines and living environments could be designed, tested and improved, they opened the door to a way of thinking that defines modern research. Observe conditions, change one variable, record outcomes, compare results, refine the system and repeat. And this cycle, which now underpins everything from hospital nutrition programs to disaster relief logistics, was accelerated by lessons learned when a chef treated a war kitchen like a controlled experiment and proved that survival could rise when chaos fell. And the deeper irony is that his work helped shift attention from heroic rescue after collapse toward prevention before collapse, a transition that reshaped priorities in medicine, public health and military planning, because preventing illness through structure is more powerful than treating illness through reaction. And that principle gained authority when officials saw hard evidence that organized feeding reduced suffering on a massive scale. And once leaders recognized that everyday systems could be engineered for health, they began funding inquiries into water quality, housing density, waste removal and institutional food safety, turning daily life into a legitimate field of study and embedding research into administration itself. And this blending of practice and analysis changed who participated in knowledge making, because cooks, engineers, nurses, quartermasters and statisticians all became contributors to understanding how environments shape human outcomes. And the boundary between craft and science grew more porous, allowing practical experience to generate questions that formal research could then explore with precision. And the legacy of that shift surrounds us now in the expectation that hospitals monitor nutrition, that armies plan sanitation, that cities inspect food supplies, and that policymakers demand data before accepting tradition as destiny. And all of these habits trace part of their lineage to a moment when someone without medical rank refused to accept that mass sickness was inevitable and instead insisted on measuring, improving and documenting the most ordinary process of all, feeding people. And the lesson that remains is both humbling and empowering, because it shows that transformative change does not always begin with a breakthrough theory. It can begin with disciplined attention to overlooked details and the courage to challenge routines that everyone else assumes cannot change. And when such attention is paired with evidence, the results can travel far beyond their point of origin, influencing systems across continents and decades. And so the story closes not with a dramatic victory parade, but with a quieter triumph, the realization that knowledge grows wherever observation meets responsibility, and that sometimes the path that alters the course of research starts beside a stove where someone decides that even in war, even in crisis, even in the most neglected corners of human systems, improvement is possible and worth proving. And that is the real irony behind this story, because the world did not change when someone announced a brilliant theory. It changed when someone proved in real time that the ordinary could be engineered, and once that proof existed, it could not be unseen. And here is where the cook truly changed the course of research, because by forcing order into a place built on chaos, he created the conditions that research requires. He made outcomes comparable, he made causes traceable, he reduced the noise that hides patterns inside mass suffering. And when the background level of preventable illness began to fall, the remaining problems became clearer. And once problems become clear, institutions start asking sharper questions, not why are men dying in general, but exactly where in the chain does death begin. Is it the water point, the storage tent, the cooking surface, the waste trench, the overcrowded ward? And that shift from vague horror to specific variables is the moment a system becomes a subject of study, because science does not begin with equipment, it begins with a way of thinking. And that way of thinking is simple: observe, measure, change one piece, record what happens, then change the next piece. And this is why the legacy of a battlefield kitchen reaches far beyond military history, because once governments accepted that health could be protected through Designed routines. They started building permanent structures to investigate routines themselves. They created commission standards, inspections reports, and statistical offices that treated food safety, sanitation, ventilation, and housing as measurable forces, not background scenery. And when those forces became measurable, they became political, and when they became political, they became funded, and when they became funded, they became studied. And that is how a practical intervention can redirect research agendas for decades, because the moment you prove a controllable mechanism, you invite an endless cascade of follow-up questions. What is the minimum nutrition needed for recovery? Which cooking methods preserve strength under scarcity? Which camp layouts reduce contamination? How does clean water change mortality curves? How do waste systems protect hospitals? And those questions belong to modern public health and epidemiology, yet in this case they were accelerated by a chef who did not enter the war to publish papers, but to stop men from being quietly destroyed by their own supply chain. And the story becomes even sharper when you realize what this implies about progress, because it means research does not only flow from universities into the world. Sometimes the world forces a problem so brutally that method emerges on the ground from practice, and once method emerges it spreads, and the people who spread it are not always the ones history expects, because in Crimea it was not a general who created the most life-saving innovation. It was not a surgeon who lowered mortality first. It was an outsider who looked at a daily routine and treated it as a system that could be redesigned. And the final twist is that this kind of thinking is still the engine behind modern evidence-based work today. Whether in hospitals, disaster zones, or large institutions, the first step is always the same: turn chaos into a process, then turn a process into data, then turn data into decisions. And that is why the cook matters, because he helped push the world from accepting suffering as inevitable toward proving that prevention can be built. And once prevention can be built, research follows, because every built system becomes a question, every question becomes a study, and every study becomes a new standard. And so the story closes not with a battlefield victory, but with a quieter transformation, the realization that the path that changes science can begin in the least prestigious place in the hierarchy, a smoky kitchen in a war zone, where someone decides that even the simplest act, feeding people safely, is powerful enough to reshape what institutions choose to study for generations.